Great. So on that note, again, that's a bit of a discussion of the challenge that's before us. And as Patrick Condon and the others in the earlier session talked about this morning, we do have some very major challenges on our hands to deal with this urbanization and the quality of the urbanization. I think everyone in this room recognizes that. But at the same time, we have a fantastic opportunity right now. I mentioned this earlier, and many of you have been, I think, following the Habitat 3 development and the declaration that's called the New Urban Agenda, which is very much on the page of what we're talking about here. That was just approved by the negotiators, the UN General Assembly, 193 countries last Saturday. That's a very exciting and momentous occasion for those of us who care about public space and place, walkable mixed use, open, diverse cities, and all the other things that we care about and that we're here to talk about. But the key challenge looming for us, and that I think we have to confront today, is implementation. How do we implement the goals that are outlined in this document, and what are the tools and the resources? What do we know about those tools and resources? Where have they been done before? Where do they work? How can they be shared? How can they be adapted to different conditions? And that, in a nutshell, is really what the Future of Places project has been all about. I mentioned also very briefly the key messages that came out of that, and I'll discuss those in a moment. But Peter and Fred both alluded to the Future of Places as a kind of a collaborative platform that involved over 1,500 people representing more than 700 organizations, 275 cities, and 100 countries, and a great pool of talent asking how healthy and sustainable cities grow, how public space is the framework, the connective matrix that makes that possible, that they have to grow upon. And that's the real urgent heart of the New Urban Agenda. So I mentioned these key messages before, and those of you who participated in the breakout groups I know were focusing on one of these 7. Adequate public spaces for all. And again, I'm not going to read them all. I just want to refresh your memory a little bit and encourage you to go online to explore these more at futureofplaces.com. A nuanced range of clearly demarcated places that provide public, semi-public, semi-private, and private spaces. A flexible framework sufficiently open to serve both informal and formal settlements, as Patrick talked about. Intergenerational mix, and so on. People-centered approach, empowering residents to develop their individual and collective capacities, getting people involved, and that's certainly the heart of placemaking. Human scale, appropriate shape, character, and scale of the buildings, forming the edges of public space. That's something that a lot of architects and landscape architects, landscape urbanists are not so quick to recognize, that we have to create and frame the edges of public space with buildings. And well-designed, appropriately sized public space improves the visual and spatial character of a city. Culture and context. Spaces should be place-based, adaptable, responsive to geography, climate, culture, and heritage. We know these things, but we don't implement them sufficiently. Sustainable spaces. We all know that's an urgent goal, but we don't seem to understand very well the linkages there. Christopher Alexander talked about being frustrated by the sort of strap-on approach, buildings that have strap-on devices, and instead of understanding sustainability as something deeper. The sustainability of cities is enhanced by compact, mixed-use development, dense centers served by a safe, well-connected network for pedestrians, bicycles, and motorized vehicles. And then, yes, renewable energy, waste recycling, native vegetation, and all the other things need to be a part of that as well. Economic spillover, this is what the group I participated in and will lead off with in a moment. And this idea that bringing people together in public space gives them a chance to be creative with one another, to interact with one another and generate creative activities, get to know one another within that primary social network, and then that's supplemented by other social networks. The ability to benefit from co-locations and adjacencies and spillovers, very, very important. A city-wide approach, looking at the city as a polycentric region, not just a bullseye in the center of a series of rings of a target, and that it's really about the fabric, as Patrick was talking about earlier, that yes, includes walkability, social interaction, multimodal accessibility, and so on, but a fine-grained, uninterrupted network of blocks and streets and lined with buildings again. So then there's a couple of sections that I'll only touch on here about implementation that include advocacy and mobilization, measurement and monitoring. These are things you'll read in the New Urban Agenda. You can go online and find the latest copy at the UN Habitat website. Public space financing, huge issue. Policies and legislation, changing the operating system for growth, the laws and the codes and the standards and the practices that are, in many cases, locking in the old destructive ways of doing things. And tools and knowledge management, that's really what brings us here today, sharing lessons with each other, building partnerships to go forward as we go forward into the new research center, and hopefully with many of you and your research and your activities that you're doing that are building a larger network to translate research into action. So on that note, we'll start with the we have 7 presenters, each of which is reporting back from one of the 7 breakouts. And we'll start with economic spillover. And where's our person who's, thank you. So I'm not sure who has been selected in each group, but if you will each introduce yourselves, and then you can just go ahead and run through the slides here. Thank you. Just push the
Okay, so introduce me. Okay, all right. Hello. I've been nominated to present on behalf of our group. Our panel was not able to make it. My name is Stephanie Allen. I'm a grad student in urban studies. I am a real estate developer by trade. I left, as some of us have, and gone into public work now. So our group spoke about economic spillover and about those benefits that investment in public spaces can make. We talked about the following points. Prioritize understanding and what the correlation between placemaking actions and economic outcomes are, and how can we identify it. So does the placemaking start and then the economic benefits? Is it the economic investment that then creates? So it's really understanding that relationship. Document and communicate that prosperity depends on diversity of activities. When a place gets boring, even the rich people leave, and the opposite is true. So it's about understanding that aspect. Understanding the evidence of gentrification and displacement. This was hotly disputed in our group about whether gentrification is a real process that occurs or is it integration. And so understanding the effects of wealth or people of more affluence moving into neighborhoods, displacement, and what is actually happening as it relates to also historical causes. Placemaking needs to be polycentric, as was just touched on. Too much focus has been on the urban core. What about thinking about placemaking in other neighborhoods throughout the city so that those economic benefits also reach those spaces? Streets, especially suburban ones, offer abundant opportunities to create new places of economic exchange and developments. And then last few points, economic needs to get out of its silo along with other fields. So this is where we talked about real estate development and the business of commerce, but there's also a government role and municipal role. There's also a role for nonprofits and advocates, and how these groups need to come together in understanding economic aspects of placemaking. Infrastructure needs placemaking and vice versa, so it's not simply just having the built environment, it's also about, it's not just that that happens and then the placemaking occurs, it's about the people and understanding how the two play together. And then also we need new financial tools to transmit future value to present transaction. So it's understanding how these investments that sometimes happen in creating the space can also have long-lasting value to people who may not see the immediate return on investment.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Sorry to be up here again. So the summary is delivering an inclusive, resilient, aspirational city vision. Inclusive. Need for political sign-up to continuity of vision through changes of leadership. That didn't come from me. Vision to be owned by community and civil society. The key research topics identified, we have 4 presentations: accommodating climate change, scenario planning and vision in placemaking, transit, a really interesting one on transit-oriented deserts, how we turn transit hubs into good, sociable places, in spaces, and that is ongoing research that contributions, please, from anybody who has good ideas of sociable spaces around transit. Third one, designing effective multi-stakeholder partnerships at the local scale. A really interesting one in terms of that continuity of involvement of civil society. New approaches to old challenges from San Francisco. Invitation to public space through play and culture, and inclusive engagement involving local people in decision-making again. So all those rang very true with me. Proposed areas of research. How do we, and we had a barrage of things, how do we transfer lessons learned across different cultures, and especially to and from the developing world? There was quite a strong feeling about that we are here, a very Western culture-based conference. How do we transfer that, and how do we learn also from the developing world? The language of public spaces, universal signs that everybody understands, friendly language, friendly signs. Who monitors places? Who best monitors places? An interesting area of research. Organization of local government. It's often very siloed with very traditional, standard departments. For instance, introducing a Department of Public Life. Transit as placemaker, such as places like Bordeaux that have used transit absolutely brilliantly to create good place. Design of resilient communities, district energy, district waste, and resource, how to create continuity in our governance, who decides? Is there another way than it just resting with officers as the continuity? Recommended next steps, take lessons to Habitat 3, we all should, and use internet platforms to share research and information such as, and I will be thanked for this, pando.sc, check it out, Sustainable Communities for Collaborative Research. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Michael. I'm Tyler Norris, and I'm Vice President of Total Health for Kaiser Permanente, a large integrated health system in the U.S. And thank you for the team that put this together and for giving this to me about 3 minutes ago. I think the most important part from the people-centered approach was that we wanted to, not in some anthropocentric sort of way, forget the environment and else, but to really look at what does it mean to have the inherent dignity and respect for human beings at the center of place, and how do we design and think in this way. So here are a couple of the conclusions that we came up with. One is that the community determinants of health and health equity need to be built into the new urban agenda. And by that, obviously, by the determinants of health, we're talking about income, education, access to food, places to be active, non-emergency transportation. Right? These are the determinants of health. Medical care is about 10% of the equation. The rest of it are all the things that places are really about. And that equity, particularly the disproportionate outcomes for communities of color and income, is the greatest challenge facing health, and we need to be able to design that in. That goes right to the heart of the second conclusion, is that displacement is not only a public health crisis, and it's rampant in our communities, but it's directly related to placemaking, and there's much we can do. Displacement is not inevitable, was one of the conversations that we have had, and that there are ways to address it, and that most communities are not addressing this at anywhere close to the level that we are capable of. Third, we need to intentionally advance anti-displacement protections, we just talked about, as part of placemaking. We need to build that in. We need to promote health and equitable land use systems. And that, of course, includes where not only urban form, but where business is developing, transportation, housing, and thinking about the way land use plays out, including agriculture and food, et cetera. And then finally, to recognize and build on the ways that communities are already places with an organic quality. There was a really important way that people were talking about. Communities have their own dignity. They have their own voice. They are already organisms, and that there's ways that sometimes well-intended people come in with brilliant ideas as if it's sort of an open slate. And in doing so is not only missing the gifts and contribution and assets of community, it's actually an act of disrespect. And it was discovered beautifully, frankly, this morning in your part, Eduardo. Research topics, and I may need to help with a couple of these. We want to better understand the relationship between placemaking and positive psychology. How do we relate place to the health of our mental, emotional, spiritual well-being and social well-being? There seems to be huge data and element pieces, but we have much that we can learn about that, particularly as the previous century was a century of infectious disease. We're currently in a century of chronic disease, and we are headed towards a century globally of mental health as the leading cause of morbidity and mortality in the world. Behavior change in placemaking. How does place impact what we eat, how we move, how we relate with each other? Research that differentiates levels of scale, micro neighborhood to community to city to region, et cetera. Research around the resistance to inclusion, and by that economic inclusion, housing inclusion, inclusion in general among middle-class populations. Many of you are familiar with the work of Raj Chetty at Harvard about economic opportunity in mixed-use communities for more vulnerable populations, and yet a lot of folks don't want those people in the neighborhood, and we need to learn a little bit more about what the opportunities are there. And develop evidence-based indicators of success for placemaking and differences across diverse groups. Recommended next steps. We need to look at economic health and access to jobs, especially in rural communities, and there was a sense that we had quite a lot of conversation about urban, large area, and we need to think about how these messages not only are cast to, but are actually apply to smaller communities. And I think kind of in closing, that if we're looking at the relationship between placemaking and health, these kinds of elements need to be brought into anything we do around community assessment and data, any investment choices, policy choices that we make, and that they have to do with practice change, so that our changes in our organizations and in design and in cities reflect this. Thank you.
I have not seen anyone from the human scale group, so what I'm going to do is just very quickly present that. You can see for yourselves, I'm not going to read every word, but expand human scale, invest in a better understanding of the complexity of the systems of human experience, very important. Emphasize better communication and conversation with the community, involving institutions, engaging with them, and I think that's actually the same set of sentences. Research needs to provide opportunities for how to bring public and design considerations earlier into the process. become more flexible in designing and changing spaces for diverse needs, innovative engagement techniques and cross-organizational partnerships. And we need to do that. I hope we're able to build some partnerships coming out of this meeting, and many of you who represent some important key allies in implementing the New Urban Agenda. On that note, I'll shift over to culture and context.
Hi everyone, my name's Kath. I'm from Colour Your City, which is a London-based initiative but with global vision for cities to use colour to actually transform their spaces and make them more vibrant environments conducive to well-being, and use cities more as a canvas for our kind of creativity. So I was part of the culture and context session, and there were really some key themes that kind of kept emerging throughout the discussion. And we identified these as threats, really, to placemaking. Those of homogenization, militarization, privatization, and overcrowding. So the research topics that we identified, one was looking at the actual emotions evoked by the experience of public space. So really kind of understanding that on a very important emotional basis. Also, are there universal values for place and placemaking? What might they be? And then also looking at how they relate to the local context as well. So locality and needs, values, traditions, and life patterns of people were very, very important aspect. And there was a number of kind of subtopics that came out of that, such as immigrant experiences, both when you're kind of moving populations or people into new areas, and how that might affect the dynamics, how that affects the dynamics of space, so kind of place and, you know, people, and how that interrelates. Also Indigenous traditions, a lot of people from different countries were kind of mentioning that need to respect and understand some of the traditions. Also the suburban experience. So again, partly how you create a sense of place as well within suburbs, edge cities. We also looked at the heritage of public spaces and really understanding how they've been used over time. And part of that is kind of looking at how we record and document space usage. Then also over-regulation. So it was kind of mentioned by one person to be looking at sort of maybe certain Western cultures, but then also the sort of need for the spontaneity, creativity, and freedom that there is to not kind of, I don't know, over-regulate the juice out of everything. How can we ensure there's a good balance there? And then also lastly, how we provide more public spaces for peace, rest and calm. We're all very busy, we're in cities, very high velocity of activities. So how can public spaces also serve the need to restore ourselves, to rejuvenate and pause? So that was our findings. Thank you.
Okay, hello. Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Howe. I'm Professor Chair of Landscape Architecture at the University of Washington in Seattle. And when I took the bus up from Seattle this morning, I didn't realize I was going to be on the stage. So I'm kind of a conference bum today. Well, thank you, Setha, for selecting me to represent our session. So the title of our session is Adequate Public Spaces for All. And we had 3 presentations and kind of 1 intervention, and that covers, anywhere from nonprofit practices to kind of academic discourses and to kind of initiative by government body. And it was a very lively discussion. I don't think these 3 points actually do justice to what was being discussed at the session, but this is basically kind of summarize what we have talked about. So in the end, basically what we did is that we kind of took the title of the session apart. So first, we thought adequate is not enough. We need to be thinking about placemaking in the context of equity, justice, and democracy, and how can the process and the ideas of placemaking engage with each of those actions. So that's kind of our first conclusion. Our second conclusion is to look at placemaking, well, public space, we actually kind of went beyond public space to look at all kinds of spaces, including headspace. And so looking at placemaking as process, the process of building capacity, not just the actual physical space, and also looking at process of disrupting and transforming power structure that are embodied in a place. We also looked at this idea of patient capital, how kind of long-term kind of process, investment, engagement need to be kind of examined in the process of placemaking. Number three, we also wanted to kind of unpack this idea of all. So what is all? Who are being addressed as all? Recognizing the heterogeneity and differences in the public, and also looking at how to move away from this kind of consensus-driven focus to a sort of an agonistic relationship that recognizes those tension and differences and conflict in the public setting. And to make that point, we didn't have consensus on that either. And next, in terms of unpacking all, we are interested in kind of amplifying the voices of the marginalized, the underserved, and underprivileged, recognizing that those voices that are not at the table need to be represented, need to be amplified, to be engaged more productively in a public process. So those are our conclusions, and we also believe that those three also represent kind of the research questions on going forward. And so what do we mean by adequate, what do we mean by placemaking, and what do we mean by all? Thank you.
Actually, there was somebody else who was going to do this presentation. Are you here? Because I think there was some confusion. All right, I'll take it over. And I'm going to do it really quick. There's a long list of things, like the other long lists of things that you've seen here, but I think my ability to absorb more words is much diminished, and I think yours is probably as well. So I'm trying to boil this down to one key conclusion. What came out of it was inspired by Laura's, I've forgotten her last name, presentation around the issues of climatic hazards and what to do about all that, was the missing element in the present reading of this sustainability objective is the disconnect between it and basically ecological landscape infrastructure, I would say, as a kind of summary point. So places have an opportunity to be ecological infrastructure. In order to do that, you need to layer in people who are doing engineering thinking, flood control thinking, natural systems thinking, and place thinking. A good example was a urban plaza that held floodwater intermittently after storm events. So its aesthetic and placemaking function is combined with its super crucial engineering function. So a lot of those have to do with how you would actually get those parties to behave in those ways and how place thinkers can be thinking very deeply and communicating more effectively with their allied professions in the protecting industry of engineering, in the provision of service industries or departments such as transportation planning and so forth, the insurance underwriter industry across the globe, and that final suggestion was, sensibly, I think, why not have those people at these conferences more than we probably find in this room today? Recommendation, I think, probably no one would disagree with. All right, thank you, Michael.